When you think about a Roman soldier, you will probably think about a soldier wearing a red tunic, rectangular shield, plate armor, and an iron helmet. This is your stereotypical Roman legionary soldier, and as the name says, a legionary soldier served in Rome's famous legions. But since its beginnings, the Roman army has made extensive use of allies, the so-called Auxilia. But who were these Auxilia soldiers, and what made them different from their legionary counterparts?
Since the early Republic, when Rome fought for control over the Italian peninsula, Rome's armies consisted of soldiers from Rome, being Roman citizens, and troops from allies, being non-Roman citizens. These allied armies were made up of levies from subjugated city-states and small nations from the Italian peninsula, like for example the Latins, Etruscans and Samnites. They were called upon whenever Rome went to war with neighboring communities. They made up the bulk of the Roman forces and were essential for Rome's success. Even though they fought and died alongside the Romans, they did not get a share in the obtained power. According to Roman rule, as they were not Roman citizens, they did not have the right to vote or be eligible for political offices themselves. Being a Roman citizen also offered more legal protection and other benefits on which they missed out. The allies were true second-class citizens to the Roman state, despite the price they paid in blood.
Rome was not treating its allies the way they deserved to be treated. And this unjustness had been smoldering for ages, when eventually the murder of a Roman politician who stood up for the rights of the allies from the spark to the powder keg. From 91 to 88 BC, a conflict raged between Rome and its former allies, called the Social War. Eventually, Rome was victorious, but not without getting dangerously close to defeat. Rome now realized the necessity of keeping its allies happy. So despite winning the war, Rome granted the allies' wishes and granted virtually all Italian peoples Roman citizenship, making them legally equal to the Romans. Now, being Roman citizens, these peoples were no longer recruited as allies, but as legionary soldiers.
These auxiliary troops under the Roman Republic were very much a separate entity, not incorporated into the Roman system at all. They wore their own equipment, had their own fighting style, had their own command structures, language, and were in service for just the length of the campaign. As a matter of fact, the same goes for foreign mercenaries that were employed by Roman generals. They can be viewed as auxilia, but more in a literal sense. They are auxiliary to the Roman army. This starts to change with Emperor Augustus, some 50 years after the Social War. Under his rule, auxiliary troops become a permanent feature of the Roman army. Instead of serving the length of a campaign, the length of their service was fixed, as was their pay. Under his successors, the standardization of the auxilia continues, with auxilia receiving the same training as legionaries, and auxilia receiving more or less standardized equipment. From this moment onwards, the auxilia become what we now know as auxilia. They served within Roman command structures, listened to Latin orders, and were Roman supplied more or less standardized equipment. They operate independently from the legions, truly becoming their own. No longer do auxiliaries serve alongside the Roman army, but in it. Even though there were now a lot of similarities between auxiliaries and legionaries, there were still considerable differences. One of the most important differences for the soldiers themselves was their legal status. Like in the past, with the allies, the auxilia did not have Roman citizenship. As was the case in the past, the auxilia were not happy with their status. Although they fought in the name of Rome, they were not treated as Romans. Naturally, this led to growing discontent amongst the auxilia soldiers. Revolts were inevitable and eventually happened in Pannonia, which was one of the major rebellions in Roman history. Under Emperor Augustus, rewarding Auxilia units with Roman citizenship was sporadic and only reserved for the most brave and loyal. During the reign of Emperor Claudius some 30 years later, we see that awarding citizenship becomes more common. It would take another revolt in 69 AD before awarding citizenship finally became standard practice under the rule of Emperor Vespasian. Besides being generous, it was probably also a preventive measure of Vespasian to secure loyalty of his Auxilia troops. The Auxilia soldiers now matched the legionaries in numbers, and so their loyalty was crucial for a stable reign.
In modern-day Romania, you can still visit the remains of the Adamclisi monument, dedicated to the soldiers of Rome who fell in the campaign against the Dacian kingdom in the very early 2nd century AD. Now, what makes this monument especially interesting is the fact that it lists not just the names of Rome's legionary soldiers, Rome's citizen soldiers, but also that of the Auxilia, Rome's non-citizen soldiers. It shows that there had been a development in Roman society. The Auxilia were no longer seen as the mere helpers of the legions, if they ever really were. They now made up an indispensable group of soldiers, vital for the Roman war machine.
Although the problem of legal status of the Auxilia was now fixed, and the Auxilia were now an accepted and integral part of the Roman army, that was not to say Auxilia and legionaries were equal in all aspects. One of the most profound differences that remained was in salary. For roughly a century, Auxilia soldiers had earned a fifth less than their legionary colleagues. It took until 82 AD, when a son of Emperor Vespasian came to power, Domitian, to change this. Having learned from his father, Domitian knew the importance of the loyalty of the army, and so he too made a positive change to the system to gain popularity with the military. He raised the salary of all soldiers and decreased the pay difference between Auxilia and legionaries to a sixth instead of a fifth.
So now let's take a look at the visual differences between an Auxilia and a legionary soldier. Here we have a legionary soldier, and over there we have an Auxilia soldier. The first clear difference that comes to mind are the shields. Now we have the legionary soldier, which is equipped with the famous scutum, a large rectangular curved shield. And we do know that only the legionaries were equipped with the scutum. There are some very rare exceptions, but we will not talk about that. Then we have the flat oval shield of the Auxilia soldier. And this shield design derives from Gallic and Germanic influence, and the Romans copied this design and handed it out to the Auxilia. And this shield design would become the hallmark of the Auxilia soldiers. So the next difference we'll talk about are the spears. Now we have the legionary soldier armed with the pilum. And the pilum is a very heavy javelin, a throwing spear, not meant for thrusting. And legionaries were the only ones armed with the pilum. It was not worn by any other type of units. And then we have the Auxilia armed with the hasta. And the hasta is a thrusting spear. Now of course you can throw it to the enemy, but it was not meant to throw. It was meant for hand-to-hand combat. So now let's take a look at the difference in armor. Here we have a legionary soldier, which is armed in the famous lorica segmentata. And here we have the Auxilia soldier wearing chainmail. Now regarding to chainmail, we are sure of the fact that both legionaries and Auxilia soldiers wore them. There's plenty of evidence. But the other way around, the evidence is not so clear. The lorica segmentata is often associated to legionaries alone. And this derives from Trajan's column. And in this Trajan's column, you see that all the legionaries are armed with the lorica segmentata, and all the Auxilia troops are armed with chainmail. So this gives the assumption that it was only legionary soldiers that wore lorica segmentata. But this is just an assumption. Because if we look at archaeology, it's not really that clear. There are plenty of Auxilia camps where they have found lorica segmentata parts. We know of a Roman province where there were no legionary units stationed at all. And also in that province there were plenty of lorica segmentata finds. So we think that it is very plausible that also the Auxilia wore the lorica segmentata. Archaeology seems to suggest this. So lastly, we have the difference in swords. As you can see, the legionary soldier is armed with the gladius, a short stabbing sword. But the auxilia soldier is wearing the spata, which is a long slashing sword. Well, we believe that at least some auxilia units were armed with the spata. And right now, we're going to tell you why.
Most convincing is a detailed account of a battle that took place in Britain in 51 AD. This battle was written down by the famous Roman author Tacitus. Tacitus makes a very interesting remark. He says that the Britons were cut down by the gladi and pila of the legionaries and by the spata and hasta of the auxilia troops. Here, he clearly distinguishes between the armament of the legionaries and the auxilia soldiers. And there's no reason at all to assume he is referring to cavalry, in which case he would have been more clear, having written down something like the Britons were cut down by the gladi and pila of the legionaries and the spata and hasta of the cavalry. Besides these written clues, common sense also points in the direction of the auxilia using a longer slashing sword. Their distinctive oval shield being the first reason for this, because the round oval shape allows the wearer to swing his weapon much more freely, and thus his shield is clearly better suited to a longer slashing sword, instead of the shorter gladius. If the Romans believed a rectangular shield, like that of the legionary, was better than an oval shield, why not give the auxilia a rectangular shield as well? Auxilia being equipped with the longer spata makes for a clear explanation. Another argument that ties into this is the fact that the auxilia were mostly recruited from Germanic and Gallic tribes, especially in the period when the equipment of the auxilia was being standardized. And the Germanic and Gallic men were used to fighting with spears and longer swords, weapons best suited for fighting in a more loose fashion at medium range, instead of the gladius, which is designed for fighting at close range. So the combination of oval shields with longer slashing swords would be more accustomed to many auxilia troops, thus requiring less adaptation and training. The Romans were very pragmatic and would not have had any major objections to troops fighting in their own style, as long as they were able to perform their intended combat role within the Roman system. In other words, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. Although the amount of spatas found doesn't quite reflect an equal availability, it seems likely that at least some auxilia units fought with the spata instead of the gladius.
With this armament, the auxilia could have employed a different, more loose fighting style to that of the legions, which operated in tightly packed close formations. Obviously a highly effective way of fighting, but not suited to all kinds of warfare. Sometimes fighting in a more loose formation can have its benefits. For example, on very uneven or forested terrain, where it is hard to maintain a tight formation. It is not that the legions were not capable of doing so, but their style of fighting and weaponry was less suited to it. In combat, the main added value of the auxilia was in their flexibility, but their flexibility also showed outside of combat.
Unlike legionaries, whose units were formed into a legion, a unit consisting of roughly 5,000 men, auxilia units were grouped into cohorts, consisting of roughly 500 men. Legions were seldomly broken up into smaller units, because the core principle of the legion was that they stayed together, exceptions aside, such as groups being sent to gather resources or guard important magistrates, for example. The cohort, however, was by its much smaller size also much more suited for different tasks. One of the most important tasks of such smaller units was manning the hundreds of small forts and watchtowers that littered the Roman frontier. These cohorts could swiftly take action against raiders or intruders due to their smaller size. It is not much work to mobilize 500 men as opposed to 5,000 of a legion. Besides, often these kind of border clashes were not worthy of using entire legions, but rather involved small-scale operations. the Auxilia were able to operate independently from the legions and did so effectively. The Auxilia had actually made up the larger part of the Roman army by the end of the 1st century AD and was eagerly employed by Roman generals, and not in a minor capacity, but often in the lead role. Again, Tacitus helps us out. He tells us of the battle at Mons Graupius in 83 AD. This was a large battle between the Romans and the tribes of Caledonia in modern-day Scotland. General Agricola had multiple legions at his disposal, but instead chose to solely rely on his Auxilia units. The legions were simply held in reserve. This shows that Agricola had much confidence in his Auxilia soldiers, and rightly so. Despite the Auxilia units being greatly outnumbered, they gained a decisive victory over the Caledonians. There are more examples of battles in which the Auxilia were of vital importance to the Roman war machine, but the most striking example can still be seen to this day in the heart of Rome. It's a 30-meter high marble column celebrating the victories won over the Dacian people by Emperor Trajan in the very early 2nd century AD. All activities carried out by the Roman army have been meticulously carved into the marble. From the building of marching camps to the gathering of grain, the building and crossing of bridges, and of course battles and the eventual defeat of the Dacian king. Remarkable is that out of the 20 fighting scenes depicted, 19 portray the Auxilia in a prominent way. What it truly shows is that the Auxilia played a very important role. They were now being honored in the imperial heart of Rome. They finally gained their well-deserved respect from the highest authority in the ancient world.
By the end of the 1st century AD, the number of Auxilia soldiers exceeded that of the legions. They were highly trained and professional troops, capable of doing that what the legions could, and maybe even more. It was mainly their blood that kept the empire safe.